Dark Souls 3 gameplay was shown to press and a few privileged fans at a closed-door event at E3. I glued myself to the moment, analyzing and memorizing as much as I could. Now, keep in mind that this was a hands-off demonstration. We didn't have free reign to dig through the entire area, nor thoroughly test every mechanic. What we saw was a mix of gameplay and slides presented by Miyazaki, and translated by Bandai Namco global producer Atsuo Yoshimura. While it was a short and limited preview, we still managed to see and learn a lot about Dark Souls 3. Here's what I know so far. Players' attacks with all weapons were strikingly similar to Dark Souls 1. The straight sword was the first weapon we saw. Its attack animations seemed to be frame by frame identical. There seemed to be at least some minor tweaking. The major change was the addition of sword arts. They seemed to function similar to Bloodborne's weapon transformations. The difference is that they change how you use the weapon, rather than changing the weapon itself. The straight sword art stance seemed to focus on heavier attacks. Among other changes, it gained a guard break power attack. This seemed to function more like a proper attack, rather than the shove or slap in Dark Souls 2. Charged R2 attacks seemed to exist, but I don't believe I saw one demonstrated. It was listed as one of the control mappings in the load screen. The greatsword seemed to have slightly better transitions for R1 combos. This is in contrast to Dark Souls 1, where there's a good bit of pause between swings. Now, keep in mind we're talking about the Ultra class weapon, which is simply named Greatsword. There was a bit of confusion over this. Some people were of the perspective that it was more like the Claymore in Demon Souls. As far as I could tell, the weapon was much larger, a bit slower, and landed at a much sharper angle during R1s. Also, despite being called a greatsword, the strong attacks seemed to be the Zweihander slam type moves rather than the greatsword pokes. A pair of scimitars were shown which were presented as a single weapon. I'm pretty sure these were referred to as the Legion scimitars. It seemed that there was no way to access the left scimitar out of sword arts. When using both together, the player seemed to move in a series of spinning motions that seemed to deal damage at all angles. At one point, the player executed a spinning attack with both scimitars that killed 4 or 5 surrounding enemies at once. Seeing the scimitars makes me wonder if it's possible to equip a regular weapon on the left hand. Perhaps it's all bows, shields, and similar tools. That would be reminiscent of Bloodborne, where it was just guns, a shield, and sprayers. The player demonstrating the game seemed to have infinite stamina at times. They were able to block nearly indefinitely with a two-handed greatsword. We did see the player get guard broken though, so I'm not exactly sure what happened there. Perhaps it was a unique guard break style attack from one of the knights he fought, but it was difficult to make out. Perhaps blocking with a large two-handed weapon has much more stability than the other Souls games. The short bow was much more agile than the previous games. You could move while shooting, similar to Dark Souls 2. There were also rolling attacks, similar to rolling and firing a pistol in Bloodborne. Power attacks were present as well. As there was no HUD, we don't know exactly how much stronger power attacks may be with the short bow. A longbow exists as well, but wasn't shown. We were told that unlike the short bow, the longbow wouldn't be as agile, but would deal more damage. If I remember correctly, it was implied that you would be stationary while firing, but would be able to hit targets from longer range. The player in the demonstration at one point accidentally kicked instead of attacking. The animation looks to be identical to Dark Souls 1. It wasn't used against an enemy, so we don't know exactly how it works. It seems that poise still exists in some form. The player was able to shrug off at least one attack without being staggered. There's also hyper armor in at least one attack that the player used as part of the greatsword's sword arts. Backstabs are instant and snappy like Dark Souls 1. The animation was nearly identical. Parries were similar. The riposte repositioned the player in a slightly jerky manner, similar to Demon Souls. It may just need some polish, and will probably look exactly like Dark Souls 1 at release. There didn't appear to be any guard crush criticals. Attacking a guard broken enemy resulted in a regular attack like Dark Souls 1. Spells weren't demonstrated at all, and we weren't given any information on spells during the presentation. I later heard that spellcasting will exist in some form by the game's release. At one point, the player was walking along some rafters above an enemy in some barrels. They threw a firebomb down to the barrels to kill the enemy in a fiery, smoky explosion. The throw seemed to be aimable while unlocked, similar to Dark Souls 1. I don't remember exactly how fast the throw animation was. I'm hoping that all throwing items are fast enough to be viable in PvP, similar to Dark Souls 2. The player also acquired some throwing knives, but they were never used. No other consumable items were shown. Estus flasks returned, and the drinking animation seemed to be identical to Dark Souls 1. As there was no HUD, we don't know how much or how fast it actually heals. We also didn't see the player combo the chug animation. It was specifically stated that the system for weapon upgrades would be based on Dark Souls 2. Hopefully this means that it's easy to change the weapon ascension with a reasonably low resource cost, without losing the weapon's upgrade level. The player's overall movement speed felt similar to Dark Souls 1, perhaps a bit faster. Rolls seemed to be fast and snappy. I don't recall how similar the animation was to Dark Souls 1. We also have no information on how many roll types exist, or how stats and equip load affect rolls. Backsteps weren't demonstrated, but it's safe to assume that they'll return in Dark Souls 3. The area shown in the presentation was more or less a large castle. It had some of the dreary color palette of Bloodborne. There seemed to be a bit more blues and grays. It was reasonably well detailed. The texture resolution was at least on par with Bloodborne, but each scene was much less visually noisy. There were more large shapes and unique areas that could serve as landmarks. It was specifically stated that everything was designed to look apocalyptic. I can't remember the exact phrasing, but they said that they were attempting to present a unique take on that theme. We were told that everything visible could not only be reached, but entered and explored. This was pretty impressive considering how large the area was. The area was also pretty vertical, reminiscent of something like Upper Sen's Fortress combined with later parts of the Boletarian Palace. With such a large area shown, I'm wondering how many different types of terrain might exist. Hopefully it's more than large castles and dungeons. If nothing else, such an enormously large area with a ton of verticality would make for some amazing invasions. Nothing in the more recent games has yet reached the same heights as the Catacombs for being such a fun, dynamic invasion spot. Hopefully there are some similar traps as well, but none were shown in the presentation. The Red Knight appears to be the mascot armor for the game, similar to the Fluted and Elite Knights or the Farum armor. There was someone cosplaying as the Knight with whom you could pose for photos. While the person doing the cosplay didn't actually know anything about the series, he was at least friendly and willing to humor me with the first player backstab and parry in Dark Souls 3. The presentation seemed to dip above 30 FPS at times. I'm hoping that they're using something closer to the Dark Souls 2 engine, or at least the renderer. They specifically referred to DirectX 11 in the presentation, which was reminiscent of what was said about Dark Souls 2. A long while back, it was mentioned that Dark Souls 2's newer engine was designed for future titles. I'm inclined to believe that Dark Souls 3 may run at 60 FPS on PC. If it needed to be 30 FPS for physics and other behaviors, I'd imagine that the game would be hard-locked to 30 FPS from the start. The console versions were confirmed to be 30 FPS, and Miyazaki seemed to be visibly put off when someone asked about FPS in general. If the PC version is locked to 30 FPS, perhaps Durant can come to the rescue once again. If so, I can imagine it being a bit more solid than Dark Souls 2. Even if there's higher durability lost for weapons, durability wasn't a significant issue outside of weapon special attacks in Dark Souls 1. No HUD elements were shown outside of the gestures menu. The gestures shown were all from Dark Souls 1, but they didn't show the typical Elite Knight icons. Instead, they looked like a hollow or generally nude player. I didn't get time to look at the entire list, but Joy and Praise the Sun existed. The animations were identical to Dark Souls 1. The sacrifice mechanic wasn't shown in the presentation, but we've seen and heard a good bit about it. At the E3 exhibit at the front of the South Hall, there was a Red Knight statue offering up a corpse as a sacrifice. A sword was embedded in the corpse, with a similar sword at the front of the scene. Pushing down the closer sword would result in the corpse spewing black water and smoke from its wound. Most of the people who visited the exhibit didn't understand the sword, so the exhibit was set up as a simple black water fountain for most of the event. What I've heard about the sacrifice mechanic, and this is mixed with speculation, is that it seems to be related to at least creating checkpoints or something similar. We did see normal bonfires, so perhaps they're few and far between. Maybe it's another way to alter the game's difficulty. In fact, I believe that I had heard sacrifices had something to do with multiplayer. Maybe you have to choose between using the sacrifice to create a checkpoint, initiate PvP, or open your world for co-op. On the other hand, if the sacrifice actually creates a bonfire, then it might mesh well with the lore behind Homeward Bones and Sublime Bone Dust. We were told that the primary factor for matchmaking would be soul level, but it was insinuated that it might be tweaked or extended from that point. It's a bummer that soul memory is being so hastily discarded. It was a great idea in Dark Souls 2 that would have shined if it were put in a better game. I'm hoping that if there's some sort of password or glyph system, it doesn't fully bypass the matching system like the recent Bloodborne update. While it's a great band-aid, and frankly cop-out for the poor connectivity, it's only going to completely ruin invasions in the long run. Very little was said about the multiplayer ecosystem, but summon signs will exist. I believe these were specifically referred to as soul signs in the presentation. While there wasn't a lot of combat, we did see a few different enemy types in the presentation. The large knight enemies felt kind of like a mix of the style and behavior of the red and blue eye knights from Demon Souls. They were roughly as threatening as blue eye knights would be for a first-time Souls player. Visually, they looked like bulkier, less undead boulder knights. They were much larger than the player. One of the knights wielded a sword and shield, where the other one had a spear and shield. They were pretty aggressive, attacking 2 to 3 times as much as similar enemies in Dark Souls 1. The spear user had a multi-hit charge similar to the Red Eye Knights in Demon Souls. The knights regularly switched between 1 and 2-handing their weapon, and seemed to use the sword art stances as well. We noticed that they seemed to drink Estus at nearly every opportunity. At one point in the demo, a large dragon appeared and breathed fire, preventing access to an upper area. We were told that placing a dragon or other large insurmountable enemy in an early area was a Miyazaki favorite. Eventually, the dragon breathed fire down the lower path, killing some enemies and opening up that area. This dragon was specifically referred to as a stone dragon. This could have some pretty significant lore implications. Outside of the dragon, some smaller hollows, and the knights, we also saw a couple of dogs. They were ashy looking, somewhat reminiscent of the dogs in Bloodborne. They were mostly harmless, not stuffing the player's attacks or being remarkably accurate with their own. We also saw a unique enemy on the rooftops. When the player approached a group of hollows, one's arm erupted with a black amorphous mass, which sucked in the rest. The mass was much larger than the host, who remained attached, upright, and mobile. The mass had a swirling, oily texture. It attacked the player with large, loosely formed appendages. There was one boss shown. It was a large armored woman with extremely fluid, almost rubbery movements. She attacked with a lot of spinning moves and long swipes. Some of the other attendees stated that she had a long neck with a head that never ceased tracking the player. I was more focused on the player and her swords. She initially used a fire scimitar, which set the surrounding area ablaze. Eventually she pulls out a second, ashy scimitar with similar behavior to the fire one. It was specifically stated that her attacks were designed to be difficult to predict. We didn't learn much about the lore of the game. The biggest piece of information we got was the repeated references to there being Lords of Cinder. They specifically stated that it's not a reference to a particular Lord of Cinder, aka Gwyn, and that there would be more than one Lord of Cinder. With the cycle repeating as characters link the fire, perhaps each rekindling of the first flame yields another Lord. I have some additional thoughts on the game's lore, but it's so full of theory and conjecture that it would be best to separate it out into another video. So that's what we've seen so far. All in all, it looks great. I think perhaps my main concern is that they may be trying a bit too hard to return to exactly what we know and love in Dark Souls 1. Demon's Souls and the later Souls games all had little features and improvements that I would hate to see ignored. Hopefully, rather than simply Dark Souls 1 with a few twists, it'll push forward into what we can think of as a proper evolution of the series. If there's anything I haven't covered, or you have any questions about Dark Souls 3, please leave a comment. As always, if you like what you've seen and wish to see more, please be sure to subscribe to the channel.